Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. Welcome again to the Arab Strategy Forum. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Hadley Gamble. I am the anchor and senior international correspondent for CNBC, and I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Vikram Mansharamani to talk about whether or not we're headed for a global recession, and whether it's, if not when, but quite
when.
how.
That's right.
Take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Hadley. Well, listen, Your Excellencies, everyone, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm honored to have some time to share with you my thoughts on the risk of a global recession. And so what I'm going to do is very quickly run through how I think about the world and how I think about the risk of a recession within that world. I'll conclude with some of my thoughts around what does it actually mean? If we have a recession, is that an opportunity? Is that a risk? Is that a threat? What will it mean? So let's begin. This is the world we're in today. The waves are crashing. We have social unrest, populism, nationalism. We have asset bubbles. We have trade wars. We have currency wars. We have a chaotic environment. That's the world we're in. Now, those are the headlines of today. You can read them in any newspaper. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that there are 4 root causes for all of these dynamics. And these 4 root causes help us explain why we are in the world we're in today. So understanding those will help us understand where we are going. So let's begin. Transition number 1 that's taking place in the world is what's happened with China. China had a credit-fueled investment bubble which has burst. The result is there's more supply. There's extra supply falling on the world stage. And this is becoming accused, or they are being accused of perhaps dumping, etc. So you can see how this can result in some tensions. That's number 1. Number 2 is technology. And in the domain of technology, we are getting more output for the same or even fewer inputs. The result is more supply. Transition number 3 is what's happening in energy. And I don't need to tell anyone in this room, but there's been major revolutions in the energy domain, particularly in hydrocarbons through shale, but also in alternative energies. We have major developments, major expansion. The result, again, is more supply. And then, of course, the 4th dynamic that's important to understand in the world is we have a transition going on where the world's largest economies are aging. The result is less demand. When people move to fixed incomes, they spend less. And so does it surprise you then that when we put these together, we have global deflationary pressures? By the way, I have to stop for 1 second and tell you about this picture. This is modern art. Apparently a 6-story rubber ducky was going on a global tour, and when it was in the Hong Kong harbor, it sprung a leak. And I said, this is the perfect picture of deflation coming from China. It's literal deflation. Okay. But what does that do? In the world where there's not enough demand and there's too much supply, countries, they want to compete with other countries to get the demand. And so what do? They use their currencies to compete. I want my currency lower than his currency or her currency, so this way my exports will be more competitive. That results in winner-take-all markets and inequality. And inequality leads people into the streets, and you get unrest. And the fundamental political dynamic that transpires, that the ground becomes very fertile for populism and nationalism. A politician can come on the stage and say, it's not your fault that you've suffered. You've fallen behind. It's not your fault. Whose fault? His fault. Her fault. Who are they? It doesn't matter. If it's outside the country, we call that nationalism, our country first. If it's inside the country, the 1%, they are taking everything, you are getting nothing, we call that populism. And so the result is redistribution pressure is coming. And we also have protectionism because fundamentally the game has been changed. Economists of the world have told everyone, listen, you don't understand. We have to grow the pie, the global economic pie, and everyone will benefit. However, that hasn't been true. Many people have not benefited. And so now the discussion is, okay, it's a zero-sum game. Don't talk to me about the whole pie or the global pie. I want you to talk to me about my slice. And so we have the dynamics we have now. And so does it surprise you then, if it's thought of as a zero-sum game, that we will have trade wars? And by the way, the trade war I'm highlighting here is not the US-China trade war because that gets a lot of attention. We have a trade war between Korea and Japan right now. This is a global phenomenon that exceeds just the US-China dynamic. And it's because of these 4 pressures. So that's the world we're in. Now, interestingly enough, that's history at some extent, right? That's how we got here. The real question, why you've all come to listen to me, I assume, is to figure out if there's a recession coming. That's the more important topic. That's the more interesting one. So let's address that topic right now. And we'll go through the indicators that I think are most pertinent right now. There's other indicators. There's many more ways to think about the world. I'm going to highlight a few, and we're going to discuss them. All right, so what do you watch? How will we know when the recession is here? What can we pay attention to? Number one, Chinese growth. You have to pay attention to it. China is too important a percentage of the global economy, as well as a disproportionate share of the percentage of growth in the world. So you have to pay attention to the Chinese economy. And by the way, it's slowing down. And there are risks in the Chinese economy. Also, they have a lot of bad debt. And it's getting more bad, if that makes sense to describe it that way. It's actually deteriorating. And there's lots of signs that indicate the Chinese debt situation can put an overhang on their economy for years to come. How they handle it is yet to be determined, but it's worth watching. Okay, number two, probably the single most important little asset or little segment of the economy that is not so little when you think about it. The US economy is more than 2/3 consumption. And the US economy is about 20% of the global economy. And so 2/3 of 20%, we've got a huge percentage of the world economy is in the US consumer. And will the US consumer keep spending? And will they keep having these multiple shopping carts pushed through Walmart? And the answer is I'm not sure. But right now there's good jobs, there's low unemployment, wages are going up. However, I'm going to show you a chart that disturbs me. And it really bothers me, and it tells me this is maybe long in the tooth. This is late cycle phenomenon, not early cycle phenomenon. And this is a chart where what I've done is I've taken the consumer confidence in America, and I've divided it by the unemployment rate. And the reason I do that is because unemployment by itself is not useful as an indicator unless people are confident. And so when they're confident and there's low unemployment, this line goes up. And then when the reverse happens, the line falls. We are at the same level as we were at the 2000 bubble in terms of confidence in this way to think about it. So this is very disturbing to me. What about economic policy? Well, we know the US Fed has raised rates and then it started lowering it. By the way, if you look at this chart, what you see is every time the line sort of goes up and starts coming down, you get a gray vertical line. That indicates a recession. Will it be different this time? I don't know. I study bubbles a lot, and I like to think, I hate using those words. Will it be different? It's rarely different. The question is when and how it'll transpire. All right, number four, economic uncertainty globally. Not just, again, US, China, but there are ripple effects. This is going US, Europe, Japan, Korea. This is paralyzing the corporate boardrooms of multinational companies. They are no longer investing at the rate they were. They said, we have to rethink how we invest, where, when, why. We have to stop because we're not sure where it's safe to invest. We don't know what the rules of the game are. And if you're going to change the rules, I can't put $1 billion investment here. That doesn't make sense. That's a risk I'm not going to take. And so corporate boardrooms have stopped investing or slowing down massively. And then, of course, we have population growth. And population growth exacerbates the problem I described earlier with too much supply, unless you give them jobs. So let me just share with you. I'll be with you on stage and with Hadley talking with you for roughly 30 minutes. But over the course of 1 hour, India will add 540 people to its population. 270 while I'm up here on stage with you. Okay, and if you think that's what's happening, sorry, Nigeria. And then if you think what's going to happen in India, India's going to add 1,800 people in 1 hour. By the way, the next hour when you go have your coffee, another 1,800 people. And then you go have another coffee, another 1,800 people, right? That's what's happening. They better create jobs. This is a real big problem for a country like India. Then, of course, we have the technology bubble, which is bursting and could go ripple through a whole bunch of different segments. Of course, the first shoe to drop here was WeWork, where we saw suddenly it went from a $40 billion valuation to under 10. Suddenly. Actually, that's not true. It was never worth 40. That's the real truth. And so many of these unicorns that are being popped right now, I believe there's more of them to come. We have one, of course, one high-profile one, but there will be more, for sure, because the cheap capital has enabled business models that have not been prudent. And so actually a recession could be helpful by cleaning up some of these bad business models. That would be useful development. All right, How about big technology? And even if you look at the public markets, this is a chart that looks at mining divided by NASDAQ. And you might say, why do you look at these two things, Vikram? These are two very different dynamics. Yes and no. Let me tell you why. It turns out that this is a ratio that looks also between basically growth investing, which is confidence, and value investing, which tends to be people who are more conservative. And what you see here is in the 1980s, late 80s, you should have invested in technology right up until the internet bubble. And then you should have invested in a real economy, commodities, if you will. Mining is a proxy for commodities. Commodities. And then you should have ridden that right to the financial crisis. Then you should have gone in technology. And now look at where we are. We're at the same ratio as we were at the top of the internet bubble. Very disturbing to me as well. And of course, we now have globally pressure to break up big technology in Europe and also in the United States. And so the question I would say is, over the next 10 years, will Google stay Google? Will Amazon stay Amazon? Will these companies be broken up? It's unclear to me what's going to happen, but I do think it's a risk and it's worth watching. Regardless, my guess is there's pressure on their profits because of these dynamics. And then, of course, there's debt. I could spend a whole hour talking to you about the problematic level of debt in the world today. This is a major topic. This has huge ramifications. But let's just stop, and I'm going to leave it at one point, which is, what is debt? Debt is taking demand from tomorrow and you bringing it forward to today. The result is at some point in the future, you have to repay debt rather than buy things. And repayment of debt is very contractionary. That is less demand. And so we have that dynamic to look forward to. And of course, we know that some markets in fact, several of the debt markets, they show no signs of distress at all. In fact, the high yield market, look at this. This high yield market shows as if everything's normal. World's great. And yet, I think that's a big disconnect from the reality I see. And of course, what do negative yields tell you? Negative yields, I tell you, when I heard about these negative yields, I said, how can I issue some of that to myself? Right? I'll borrow $100 million, I'll give you back 95. No problem. This is a good deal. But it indicates that people are more concerned about, number one, deflation, because maybe the rates are actually real positive. So that might be one dynamic. The other dynamic may in fact be that there's just way too much money, they have no place to put it, and they care about return of capital, not return on capital. And that makes for a really risky forward view if you believe that's their answer. India, what about India? Everyone seems to love India. Let me say one thing very simply, very bluntly, very directly. India will not be the next China. It is not going to be the next China. In fact, I think India is likely to be the biggest disappointment relative to investor expectations over the next 10 years of any major country I can find. Why is that? Because Modi has a competition underway. A, he has too many people, we know that. We've seen that with the population growth rate. But he has to create those jobs. India's adding 1 million people per month to its labor pool, and they need to create jobs for all of them. And so he said, we're going to have Make in India campaign. Except people are bringing manufacturing, but they're using robots to manufacture, not people. Because the unskilled, illiterate Indian farm worker cannot go to a factory and compete with the robot. And so we have ultimately a real possible disappointment in India. What about technology? It's expanding everywhere. We know that, right? We know it's expanding everywhere. Look at these two fish. The one behind has been genetically modified. And look at the same age of these two fish. Same age, the one behind was what does this do to supply? Remember the problem I said earlier, too much supply relative to demand. What if we have technology help us move forward faster on supply? And we get more deflationary pressure, more supply, the problems continue. And then of course, the big elephant in the room that we must at least address, I know other sessions have touched on it, is the US-China rivalry. And let me say one thing very cleanly, very bluntly, very basic. This is not just a trade war. If you see President Trump and Xi Jinping shaking hands and saying trade truce, that is not a sign that everything is clear. That is not a good sign. That's a sign that, okay, maybe there's some politicking for some election or something in the short term. But I'm telling you, that is not. Why? Because this is a technology war. We know that. Just last night, I read in the Financial Times, China told all state employees, you can no longer use computers manufactured by American companies. Get rid of your Hewlett-Packard, your Dell, anything manufactured by American companies, get rid of it. You can't use it, or software. Okay, so this is turning into a technology war for sure. We have a space race, arms race, currency war, tech war, trade war. This is a great power rivalry. And of course, the Belt and Road is actually part of that story. This is building an alternative economy when instead of going east towards the United States, they're going west towards, towards Central Asia, here into the Middle East, into Africa, up to Europe. It's a reorientation of the world. And by the way, they're building their institutions to go with it. So you have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The result is global supply chains are shifting right now. Companies are saying, global companies can say, I cannot have sole supply risk in China. I can't have it. It's too imprudent for me as a company to do it. So the corporate boardrooms I talk to, they're all saying, okay, we need to have another possible route somewhere else. And they're doing that. And the result is, we may see two global economies. All right, so what happens when we put all these pieces together? If I put these pieces together, I apologize. I know this is a very small font and you can't see it everywhere, but what I'm suggesting is these indicators are showing me that in the next 24 months, there's a high propensity, high probability that we're going to hit a lot of these indicators. And these indicators usually come 12 to 18 months before we have a good recession. So what I'm saying is we are within 36 months of a recession. I feel very comfortable saying that's a high probability event. Now, of course, central bankers, others can do things that prevent it, but that's the high probability event. That's what I would like to say. All right, so what does that mean for here? Let me conclude on a couple different topics, and then we'll take some questions. First thing is technology. Technology is taking away jobs. We know that. India is the prime casualty. But the other thing it's doing is it's enabling what I would call asymmetric commerce. And asymmetric commerce allows small population countries like the UAE to compete on a global scale with manufacturing and other things because you can do 3D printing, not just for the parts to build a building, 3D printing for exporting goods and services. You don't need big manufacturing facilities anymore. So that you can think about that opportunity or threat, your choice. How about climate change? Actually, on climate change, let me share a story with you. I often get invited to speak to different school groups. And while I'm comfortable speaking to large audiences with heads of state and corporate leaders, I have no discomfort, no anxiety about doing that. I had to go speak to a group of 7-year-olds about climate change. This gives me anxiety, actually. I'm nervous about speaking to them. But I simplified my message, and I arrived at the school. And when I arrived at the school, I stood up in front of the class, and they already are raising their hands. And I said, you haven't heard anything I'm saying. What's the question? And so one young girl said, I know you're going to talk about climate change. My dad is solving climate change. I said, oh, lovely. What does he do? Is he a climate scientist? Is he an environmental engineer? What does he do? And she said, no, my dad drives a Tesla. Of course, I laughed also. I said, okay, now what does that mean? Why is it that he drives a Tesla? Does that save the environment? She said, you don't know? We don't use the dead dinosaurs in the car that makes the dirty air. We use electricity. It's clean. I said, oh, and where does the electricity come from? And she says, comes from the wall. And of course, I laughed also. I didn't have the heart to tell her that it's coming from a hydrocarbon-fired power plant. The reason I bring up this story is there are big opportunities when you think about climate change and actually doing things. So again, it's your choice whether you think of it as an opportunity or a threat. And of course, the US-China rivalry. This is going to be a big topic that you have to think about either as an opportunity or a threat. And how you think about that, how you navigate that, that's a big and important strategic question. Lastly, there is this recession. And everyone will naturally be fearful of this. And I'm going to suggest to you, you can think about that also, not just as a threat, but possibly as an opportunity. Because ultimately, my message to you is it's all about how you think. It is a mindset question. And no one will fault you if you think like a threat-oriented person, local, short-term, vulnerable. Alternatively, I would encourage you to think like an opportunity-oriented person, global, long-term possibilities. And I think you'll have a very good, bright future. I'll leave you with this last quote, and then I'll let Hadley ask me some questions. So Warren Buffett said it perfectly, and I think this is how you should think about the recession. Right now, many people are greedy. You should be worried. But once there's the recession and people are worried, you should become greedy. So those are my organized comments. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me. This is my contact information if you'd like to keep in touch.
Vikram, there are so many places to go with that, but I want to ask you specifically off the top to talk about what this means for financial markets, because we're at a moment where the S&P 500 is up over 25% year to date. The Dow's up over 20% year to date, and the U.S. economy has just added 266,000 jobs.
Sure. Well, the 266, I would tell you, needs to be adjusted possibly. We had a large number of GM workers that came back, but nonetheless, it was a good jobs report. The U.S. economy seems to be doing okay, all right? Financial markets, they are a representation of interpretations of economic conditions. So there's a couple layers of removal there, and valuation connects them. And the reason people say they're up is they've been going up a lot. The valuation actually, even though some people would think it's extreme, given where interest rates are, it's not clear that they're that crazy, right? I would say that there's limited upside, I could agree to that, and I think there's probably disproportionate downside in equity markets. So I'm not excited about equity markets, but I don't see some nasty catalyst to make equity markets collapse. I do think there's areas such as technology that are probably long in the tooth, late cycle phenomenon. I think there's other areas, and some of the traditional old companies, value-oriented companies, they are being left for dead. I mean, there's a situation I'm working on right now. I mean, probably trying to deploy $3 to $4 billion, and we can get a teens return, and people don't want to hear the story because it's old economy left for dead. They want the technology, the growth story.
Is this the Trump economy? Is this the economy that's going to get him reelected in 2020?
Well, the Trump economy, it's interesting. I think 2017 into 18 was the Trump economy because we had tax cuts, et cetera. I think since then, it may actually be indicating a tougher global economic environment, and there's a flight to quality. When people get scared, where do they go? They go to the US. That's generally where they park the capital. There's rule of law, there's deep markets, there's liquid conditions, you can come in and out. It's a decent place to park capital, especially in times of distress. So I actually am not convinced it's not just a flow argument, that actually the world is getting more uncertain and money's coming to the US for that reason. So I'm not sure about it. Now, as to whether Trump would get reelected, if the economy stays strong, I think he's got a really decent chance of being reelected. I actually think it's not about Trump, and I would argue this was the same thing in 2016. It wasn't that Trump necessarily won, it was Hillary lost, and a combination of two. And I think we get a repeat of that potentially here. It's really about who goes up against Trump that's going to determine that race.
When we talk about what happens next in terms of central bankers.
Central bankers, sure.
The question that we ask again and again on CNBC, have they run out of the tools?
Yeah.
They've left the park, so to speak.
Look, I mean, there was a story on, I have to say it quietly since she's on Bloomberg. Bloomberg. But anyway, Bloomberg had a story about quantitative failure. Right? I mean, the fundamental truth is, think about this. We have put trillions and trillions of dollars into the new money in the world, and this is where we've gotten. By the way, at one point, I think I did this analysis in June or July, the amount of debt that was negative yielding was roughly $16 trillion. I think it was June. It's come down a little bit. It went up between there. In June, the amount of debt negative yielding was $16 trillion, and the amount by which the BOJ, the BOE, ECB, and Fed had increased their balance sheet was $16 trillion. I said, okay, that tells you a story. We're pushing on a string. There's nowhere for the money to go. If you had people borrowing, investing, saying, hey, let's try to invest in the real economy, not financial markets, then we would have something to talk about. They were being effective. Well, all they've done, as far as I can see, is inflate asset prices.
Before I let you go, I want to ask you specifically about that U.S.-China conversation. Because obviously that's something that we speak a lot about on CNBC. And over the last several months, I've had the opportunity to speak to several folks about this, not least the Secretary of State of the United States. One of the things that I asked Yusuf Teba, His Excellency, UAE's ambassador to Washington recently, I said, what are some of the things on the horizon that you see as potential stumbling blocks or challenges in the U.S.-UAE relationship? That is specifically what he went to immediately. He said, our conversations in Washington often I have to deal with the rise of China. And I have to sit there and explain to my counterparts that this isn't something we can't be a part of at this point. When I had the chance to sit down even a week after that conversation with Mike Pompeo, I asked him about that specifically and how the Americans plan to deal with that fact. And he essentially said to me, UAE knows friends are. And that does lead me to wonder at what point does this administration ask UAE to make a choice?
Yeah, look, that's a very tough problem. It's a problem. It has a huge ramification, obviously, for the local dynamics. I don't know the answer to it. I wish I did. I think a lot of people want to know the answer to your question of when that issue will get forced. All I can say is this. It's worth thinking about right now before you're asked. It's worth thinking through the different scenarios and what the ramifications of those scenarios may be. It's worth thinking about under what terms you go in which camp and which. Maybe it doesn't have to be either or. Maybe there is a middle ground. Maybe there's a negotiated way to think this through, et cetera,
Because it became pretty apparent to me that the Americans haven't thought that through.
Yeah, I think the Americans haven't thought through the different middle ground logic. It's not a thoroughly discussed topic, at least among the people I've talked to.
Final question. Trump get reelected?
Yeah, look, I told you. I think, as I said about the statement earlier, I think if the economy stays really strong in the United States, as it has and appears to be, then I think he's got a very good chance of being reelected. The way I would say he's definitely going to get reelected is if we put a very polarizing figure against him. Or someone who has enough baggage that comes with them and sort of different, sort of looked as a long shot candidate. So I think that, honestly, if you look at what Trump's done, a lot of people like to poke. Lots of reasons we can dislike President Trump. He did lower taxes first time in 40 years. He has agreed, and Washington has agreed to take on China. Right? This is something. Look, there's very few things people in Washington D.C. can agree upon. Very few. Very few. They agreed on taxes, and they agreed China to be addressed. Now, how they get addressed and under what terms and what conditions, okay, that's a debate. But the fact that it needs to be on the agenda as a topic to address is something that Trump took to the forefront and is getting credit for having done that. All right? Other topics, NATO. He needed NATO to pay their bills. The American people, why are they not paying their bills? Okay, they're stepping up and starting to pay some of the bills. And so there's a lot of things we dislike about President Trump, and I'd argue lots of people around the world. And there's some facts that progress he's made. I don't want to express a personal opinion on what I would suggest, whether he's a good or bad president. But I think there's a balanced view often doesn't get represented.
So 36 months to the recession?
I think we've got a reasonable chance of a pretty good recession within 36 months. Yes.
Vikram, we're going to have to thanks so much
for your time.